Keith, when we drive across Iowa, what we see now was not originally on the landscape. What we do see is an almost uninterrupted plain of monocultures of either corn or soybeans, some pasture land, only the occasional upland or riparian timber, and even more rarely, the original grasslands, practically never the original grasslands. The engineered landscape, if you will, is girded by a complex of artificial drainage systems which, along with modern cropping practices, has done much to impact water quality and quantity in our state. Keith Schilling is a research engineer at the Iowa Geological Survey and an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Iowa. He received a BA from Knox College, an MS degree from Iowa State University, and a PhD degree from the University of Iowa. Keith conducts research on a variety of water-related issues in Iowa, including surface and groundwater interaction, non-point source pollution, and watershed and floodplain processes. Please welcome Keith Schilling.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's a very unique situation to give a presentation like mine following Bill's presentation. So there was some overlap, which I appreciate because I left a lot of things on the cutting room floor, but there was a lot of stuff to talk about. So as this is loading, one of the the challenge I was given was to talk about Iowa's water quality on a historical perspective. So the idea that water quality now is as worse as it's ever been, or we seriously have some water quality issues, but I think it's important to remember where we've come from and see the evolution of water quality over time. Okay, we're off and running. So I will have a lot of stuff here, so keep that in mind. I'll be here all day. Give me a question if there's something that comes up that I didn't spend enough time on. But what we'd like to talk about today is how has Iowa's land cover changed. We're taking a 150-year perspective here. So to get us up to the current situation that Bill described, how did the land cover change? How has the quantity of Iowa's stream flow changed over time? There's not enough time to talk about a lot of the aquifer stuff and the groundwater issues. As Bill set it up, we're going to be focusing on the surface water quantity and how have the land cover and management changes and hydrologic alterations, what effect has that had on water quality? We all know that historically we've come from, our landscape was tall grass prairie and savanna. In 1850, this is what Iowa looked like, not necessarily yellow, but yellow grasses anyway, waves of grasses out here. And this grass was deeply rooted. We had an infiltration-based landscape with extensive root development in some of these landscapes. This came from Laura Jackson, who has highlighted some of the dense root network that forms on these prairie landscapes. So the prairie vegetation had enormous potential to suck up water and nutrients. And again, it was an infiltration-based landscape. Today, as Bill was talking about, we're overwhelmingly agricultural, 60 to 70% row crop of corn and beans. So you think perhaps that's where we was a either or, that we went from prairie to row crop. We've actually had a change in our landscape over the last 150 years. If you look at the diversity of landscape over this time period, corn quickly established the dominant agricultural commodity in Iowa. But the orange line there is oats. Okay, we used to have a lot of sod-based crops, oats, hay, alfalfa, and things like that. And the blue line is the soybeans. The soybeans have really come in over the last 60, 70 years. But we had at one time a landscape early in the 20th century that was probably half row crop and half sod-based commodities. And we've seen over the last 70 years that, again, the corn acreage has stayed about the same, but over this time period, the soybean acreage is the one that's really increased substantially. So now, from soybeans increasing from 1 to 11 million acres, over 60 years, and now we're talking about the whole row crop, corn and soybeans alternating, increased 30 to 40% over 60 years, okay? That has tremendous influences on water quality. At one point, we had a landscape that was highly diversified. This is a mosaic of a couple of sections in Winnebago County in 1941. You see the mosaic of a landscape, hay, oats, corn, soybeans, pasture, other crop, okay? Take a landscape like that. This was 1976, okay? We don't even have the oats there, I'm sure now, but we've gone from a landscape that had this diverse mosaic of land cover to one that's dominantly corn and soybeans. So, and we've seen the same thing over the entire upper Midwest that Bill highlighted with the drainage. The darker the red says there's more soybean increase over the last 50 years. The soybeans is not like the enemy here. It's just this marker for once you introduce soybeans, you're moving to a two-crop corn and soybean rotation. So you highlight the increase in soybeans in this case. It just says that's the increase in annual crops of corn and soybean. Of course, if we're going to talk about altered hydrology, which I'm going to quickly veer into in the stream flow changes, we got to acknowledge at this point that precipitation is also increasing across Iowa over the last 150 years. This figure from Gene Tackle shows that we're looking at an 8% increase over the last 150 years. Okay, so we have altered hydrology, but we've also got more water in the system. So we got more hydraulic changes to talk about because there's more water. But really, what has changing the land cover done to watershed hydrology? That's the question, the first part of the question we're answering. One way to do that would be something like, not to get all technical on you with these idea of curve numbers, which is just to say, if you take some rainfall, you have a normal cropping system, how much runoff would you expect to see from these cropping systems? Okay, so there's no way you're going to see that, but let's just say that we have a row crop on glacial till in poor condition. It has a curve number of 88, okay, out of 100, and we'll see where this goes here in a second. You take a meadow on that same land cover, and it has a curve number of 71. You take this idea of these two curve numbers, you go to a nomograph and say, all right, for a 4-inch rainfall on poorly conditioned glacial till with straight row crops, we could expect a 4-inch rainfall to produce 3 inches of runoff. You take the same 4-inch rainfall over a meadow of grass, you might get 2 inches of runoff. So land cover matters in terms of generating runoff from landscapes, okay? That one I think makes intuitive sense to everybody. So you take a watershed such as the Turkey River at El Dorado, historic floods in 2008, 50% row crop land cover. What if something like that was all in grassland? Well, you'd still see floods. There's a lot of water moving around, but you might see the peak reduced. You might see more extended recessions and things like that. So land cover matters for generating water, flooding, surface water runoff. Now, a quick little deviation into hydrology a little bit. When we're talking about stream discharge, we can break up the stream discharge into how much of that water is running off the landscape versus how much of the water is seeping into the channel with base flow. These two components become very important because these two components drive the movement of pollutants across the landscape. Surface runoff, the overland flow runoff, is the primary source for the sediment and the phosphorus generation. On the other hand, subsurface discharge to the stream is base flow, and we'll see later tile drainage is the primary pathway for nitrate and anything dissolved in the water. So the hydrology really matters in terms of what is your pollutant of interest and how is it delivered to your waterway. Bill highlighted the Raccoon River. It's a nice little laboratory because it's got a great long-term data set. And we see changes in hydrology in the Raccoon River that's really typical across much of Iowa. We've seen discharge go up in the river over time. Annual discharge there in the upper left. Upper right is the base flow discharge. Remember, this is the groundwater seepage into the stream. It has about the same slope and same trajectory, increasing base flow. Storm flow in the lower left has increased a little bit. And the base flow percentage, which is saying how much of the total discharge is due to base flow increases, okay? And that's gone up significantly. Very typical. We've seen this all across Iowa. Here's the Cedar River. Maximum and minimum flows, both of those have gone up since 1940. The base flow increase has been greater than the storm flow maximum peaks. Much of the changes that we've seen in stream flow are due, that occurred primarily over several months. The dominant months, April to July. This just compares stream flows in the Cedar River before and after 1973. We see the big change in the stream flow characteristics occurring in the April to July period in the river. So why do we see increasing base flow in Iowa? That's always kind of an interesting question. There's a couple reasons, one of which I'll highlight here first is that there's a big difference between the ET, the evapotranspiration that comes from annual crops versus a seasonal crop. Annual crops like grass, trees, pasture, you see has initial, mid-season, and late-season ET. That's just saying how much of that potential evapotranspiration is being used. Perennial vegetation has a strong early-season component. All of them are transpiring water through the mid-season, and in the late season, the perennial vegetation is transpiring more. That matters because seasonal crops in particular are very poorly timed for when we have rainfall. So we have vulnerable periods in the spring and the fall where we have precip occurring and there's no crop being grown, okay? So we have these vulnerable periods in the spring and the fall that would generate excess water on the landscape. They're vulnerable because this is what's being grown or not grown on the landscape in those two time periods, okay? So we have these extended periods of time where we have nothing being grown, a lot of opportunity for infiltration, runoff, etc. So we can use a simple water budget to say, how does land cover affect how much water and discharges in the stream channel? If we compare a watershed that's dominated by grass and perennial vegetation versus seasonal, assuming the precipitation is the same, we've just said we have greater ET under perennial vegetation. The simple water balance would say that we have more stream flow occurring under seasonal crops because there's just less ET in this water balance. Okay, so the flow early in the 20th century should be less than what it is after because we've changed cropping to more seasonal crops. We can take that same water balance and say, what does that do for base flow? Again, we have greater ET under annual crops, therefore we have less groundwater recharge. Vice versa, for the seasonal crops, we have more base flow occurring under seasonal crops than we do for annual cropping systems, annual like grasses and perennial vegetation. So changing the land cover from perennial to seasonal crops results in an increase in base flow. And lo and behold, like I said earlier, this is what we see all across Iowa, increasing base flow in all the major rivers. We see the same thing occurring in the entire upper Mississippi River, where we've seen increasing seasonal crops with this soybean idea. We see greater base flow. The Cedar River has doubled in base flow in 60 years. Of course, you take a landscape that we have that's very wet, very flat in places, and you try and crop it. You've got to alter the hydrology to get crops to grow. We're among the most dominant altered landscapes in the world. Bill did a good job talking about the drainage districts. Oh man, whoops. We'll let him take over on that one. So I'll skip some of the drainage district stuff since that's what Bill talked about. I was going to show the same slides, which essentially we have the drainage districts on the Des Moines lobe. We see that we know where the big drainage tiles are in the network of the drainage districts. We don't have an idea where the field tiles are located, and I was going to show exactly the same image that Bill showed. It showed over a 2 square mile area that we had 56 miles of field tile compared to 3 miles of drainage district tiles. So you can't talk about altered hydrology without understanding something about where the field tiles are. That's been a hugely important change in the hydrology. All right, now I'm at the limits of what I can talk about. Oh, I'm sorry. You would not know what I'm seeing here on the screen, would you? Something just shut it down, so now we're restarting it. So I apologize for that. Yep. So at this point, I'll jump ahead of the tile drainage. I think we all recognize that tile drainage is a huge component. So let's go to the next part of altered hydrology here, and then we'll get to the water quality. I wanted to start with the hydrology and say what has changed there. That's a great question. If you look at hydrograph separations, we've done both models and field level. There's a storm flow component to tile drainage, especially if there's a lot of surface inlets, but primarily it shows up in the base flow, and which is, not coincidental, is that's the change in the discharge that we see in a lot of the streams is the March to July period, which is the time period when tiles are routinely flowing. Yes, exactly. So yes, the increase in and I would also will add conservation to that practices. We've done a lot of things to change the partitioning of stream flow in Iowa, including the land cover change in the ET. We've added tile drainage. We've done conservation to essentially drive water in the ground and reduce runoff, all of which coincide and produce the same increase in base flow. Oh, well, we're a ways away here. Here's the tile drainage indicated. We have massive tile drainage up to 1920. A comment that even from 1913, we say that the tile drainage infrastructure as of 1913 cost $50 million more than the Panama Canal. That's the level of investment in subsurface drainage that we've made. On a big scale, we know where these systems are, the drainage districts that Bill talked about. Here's the same photo of an area in north central Iowa where we see the differential in soil moisture due to tile drainage. If you digitize all the lines on that thing, it would suggest that we have 56 miles of field tile compared to the drainage district line. All right, let's move past the tile drainage. We've also altered our system with extensive levees, dams, and channelization. There we go. So we've channelized a lot of streams, okay? We've cut off meanders, we've squared up farm plots, we've done everything we can to get the water more efficiently move over the landscape. We've removed riparian vegetation, okay? So all of these things are the alterations we've made to the landscape that affect the hydrologies. We've modified the habitat, gone from diverse riparian meandered channel habitat to straight ditches. We destroyed it in other ways with animal agriculture, access to streams. We've had a lot of habitat destruction. Part of what we see is also the extirpation of fish in Iowa. This came from Iowa DNR, that we've seen a handful of fish, both removed or eliminated completely in Iowa, and also a handful of fish that are found only rarely, compared to 19 surveys done at the turn of the last century. Some fish have been lost forever. Other fish we got actually a greater abundance in fish species richness, mainly because of the invasives that have come in. But overall, it's been a net loss of fish population and fish species richness in Iowa. Hydrological alterations have also occurred essentially, we've made all these landscape changes. We've put more water in the system. Our drainage network has actually expanded greater than it used to be before. This is a view of the Bear Creek watershed on the Des Moines lobe, where initial surveyors' notes noted that the channel was barely evident in the lower part of the channel. Over the course of managing this stream system and putting extra water in the system from the hydrological alterations, this whole entire stream network has grown. So now we have streams that never used to be there. They're more integrated than they ever were, especially in the Des Moines lobe. All right, so that's just the hydrological alteration. Now really the main part of the presentation is like, what has this done to water quality over time? I've had different versions of this. This is what I settled on for you guys, lucky or not, is that I envisioned this as a general curve where we have a period of slow kind of changes, and then we move into a period of rapid changes and landscape modifications, and then we slow up again over the last 20 years. You can see just from those pictures how our world has changed over that time. One of the things we're going to talk about is the contribution of point and non-point sources, and Bill highlighted some of this. Point sources, we're not going to include drainage tiles yet. Drainage tiles, or point sources, are wastewater treatment plants and industry stormwater directly coming from a pipe, compared to the non-point sources, water running off the landscape. All right, so you need to be aware of the two definitions of where we're talking about. If we go early in the 20th century, our Iowa's first pollution law was actually passed in 1851. Okay, there's no enforcement mechanism. A second one 22 years later. Well, this just said, even at this time, that you get fined or imprisoned for throwing dead things, garbage and stuff in rivers. Okay, our very first pollution law, 1873, it was also increasingly recognized that we have a problem with point source pollution at this time. Non-point source was kind of just the early stages of being recognized. But really, interestingly enough, as far as 1893, this Seth Meek was the one that did the fish surveys at the time. I don't know if you can read that. Let me read a few of these lines here, very interesting. He's been informed that many streams formerly deep and narrow and abandoning in pickerel, bass, and catfishes have since grown wide and shallow, while the volume of water in them varies greatly in the different seasons, inhabited only by bullheads, suckers, and a few minnows. This is because the soil, since loose from the plow, is much more easily washed into the streams than when it was covered with native sod. Thus, the water in the streams is muddier than formerly in wet weather and deeper, and in dry weather is more shallow. These features, together with the fact that rivers were becoming to some extent the sewers for large cities, is a probable cause for the diminution of the food species. So this is 1893 that this comment was made. So that's recognized early on that Iowa's got some water quality issues. On the other hand, nitrate concentrations were very low. If you look at concentrations in a limited record that we have from 1900, they're all less than 1 milligram per liter. There wasn't much nitrate around. Okay, moving from this early period, I would argue that we have this period of very rapidly changing water quality. This period of the widespread landscape modifications. Extensive tile drainage, channelization, stream straightening, point source pollution problems are very severe, okay? A cartoon from Ding Darling in 1923 says, what man has done to the most beautiful gift of nature, the river. And it shows waste discharging from packing plants, open pipes. The fish is saying, what's going on? It's the reason why I don't want to live here. Okay, so this is 1923. We recognize that there's a serious problem with pollution in Iowa. All right, any more time? Any more questions? Yes. I think cover crops are a very important part of the solution to this issue because it really does start to address these vulnerable periods where we have excess water and nutrient loss in the spring and the late fall because, the sod-based crops that we had in the past were largely doing that, and that's what we've lost. So we've got in the middle of the summer when, July and August when our crops are are growing in great abundance. That's when typically all the water and the nutrients are being taken up by the crop. So I think cover crops are definitely part of the solution. We just have to increase them from less than 1% to a huge percent of the land. Can't see what I'm seeing here again. Another reboot. So yes. Yes, has stream bank erosion increased over the years? I think we recognize the problem a lot more. There was a photo here that I've shown that maybe in here that highlights the fact that people have always been concerned about stream bank erosion. So I would imagine some of the early stuff that I've read from the 1900s and early. Streams were really rapidly degrading at that time and down cutting. I think probably bank erosion was more severe then as it is today. However, the deal is we recognize the issue a lot more today, and we're taking action. Okay, so this is where we left off. When water quality was worse, sorry, I ended the question there, but let's get through this. When water quality was worse, we had no wastewater treatment in many of our streams. This is a map from 1936 that says that all the major rivers, all the major cities were discharging raw waste into the major rivers. If you look at, this is a terrible photo, it just shows from 1952, raw hog waste in the Floyd River being discharged into this Floyd River. I find this interesting. This is 1969, talking about Omaha discharging. They built their first wastewater treatment plant in 1969. Prior to that time, all the packing waste were discharged directly to the Missouri River. And there were times when the flow in the Missouri along the shore was literally red with blood, okay? This is 1969. Imagine this over the course of the last century. Omaha's water treatment plant went in operation 4 years ago, 1965. Before that, it too dumped all of its waste untreated in the Missouri River. Okay? That sounds worse to me than today. Water quality in the past, there was a golden age of wastewater treatment. 1925, say to 1950, some of the best treatment plants in the world at that time were being built in Iowa. Things like ammonia concentrations that used to be sky high, very toxic to fish, were cut way back. We're treating all the biological waste. Huge improvement in terms of our water quality in Iowa. Second issue that was highlighted by Ding Darling was what happens to the sediment. This is from 1947, classic cartoon, what the mud in our rivers adds up to each year, okay? Massive amounts of sediment moving downriver. Of course, we farmed at that time, straight up and down the slopes, moldboard plows. We mobilized a ton of sediment at that time. Severe problem. Accumulation in our floodplains, several feet, 6, 8, 10 feet deep of recently mobilized sediment in our floodplains. However, over the 20th century, there's been a humongous investment in expenditures to reduce soil loss on our landscape, okay? If you look at expenditures, this is from the USDA talking about in 2009 dollars, how much money was spent across the country for sediment reductions. It shows that we have billions of dollars spent in conservation after the Dust Bowl and post-World War II, okay? Billions of dollars spent to reduce soil erosion on our landscape. Farm bills in 1986, Farm Bill and ongoing suggests we also have a commitment to reducing sediment erosion. And what we see is in the Raccoon River, again, because of the Des Moines Water Works and their data collection over time, we have a great record of sedimentation in the Raccoon River. We've already seen with this line that discharge is increased in the Raccoon River, okay? Look at the sediment concentrations have declined significantly in the Raccoon River over the last 80 years. If you look at sediment load, the load is the product of concentration times discharge. That's also decreased. We had a maximum sediment load delivered in 1972, and for those of who might be old enough to remember, that was the Nixon administration. Earl Butt's Freedom to Farm days, we just had a 10% increase in the amount of row crop in a single year with an above normal rainfall year, and we had huge sediment loads that year. But otherwise, the ratio of sediment concentration to discharge is going down. Okay, that's a good story. The sediment conservation practices seem to be working. Of course, over the last 140 years, we talked about the change in the production of sod-based crops versus row crops. Of course, when you get in the 50s and to 70s, we've lost all the sod-based crops needed to feed horses and other livestock. We've increased our mechanization. Of course, we had a huge increase in fertilizer inputs. It's well understood, even today, back then, nitrate concentrations in our streams relate very significantly to how much row crop is in a watershed. In fact, you could take the row crop percentage in a watershed, multiply it by 0.1, and that's about the mean annual concentration of nitrate you're going to get. Tile drainage that Bill's talking about, of course, contributes to concentrations and loads. This is a couple of years worth of monitoring in a watershed in north central Iowa. Nitrate concentrations exceed the MCL of 10 milligram per liter. Nobody's drinking this water, but they still exceed the nitrate concentrations 90% of the time. Okay, so it's well understood that we have high concentrations exported from drainage districts. Of course, combined with the fertilizer additions and the change in hydrology, things like that, nitrate concentrations in our streams increased greatly over the 20th century. So we had concentrations that were less than 2 in the 1950s in our major rivers. Their average concentration, you see that they peak a lot higher, are between 6 and 7 milligrams per liter. All right, let's end with this period now, which I call kind of a period of landscape and water quality stability. It doesn't make it good. It just means that we don't have this period of rapid change going on. Of course, with modern perceptions of water quality, it says that the sky truly is falling for the most part, that it could be better. Let's just say that. If you look at one of the recent impaired waters lists, you'll also see that some of the impairments, or actually a lot of the impairments, are due to habitat alterations. Habitat alterations related to all these changes in the landscape that we made over the last 80 years. Currently, we estimate that point sources from urban wastewater and stormwater contribute to 8% of the total nitrate load, 92% non-point sources. Of course, Bill's very aware of the nitrate impairment in the Raccoon River. Concentrations exceed the MCL over this period, about 25% of the time. Let's skip that. So we know there's an impairment in the Des Moines River, or in Raccoon Rivers. What have concentrations done recently? Okay, there's been with the lawsuit, there's been a huge interest in, are things really getting worse? And that was one of the motivations for looking at ambient water quality data across Iowa. We looked at 14 years of monthly nitrate concentrations in 46 different river sites across the state. The red dot there are the ones that show an increasing trend, a significantly increasing trend, okay, statistically significant. Interesting enough, they're all draining to the western Iowa and the Missouri River. If you put all these, well, actually the other point to make is that 80% did not show a significant trend. On the other hand, if you look at lumping together all of the trends from 46 different sites, you'll see that most of them are on the positive side of zero. So we do, as a state population, appear to be increasing a little bit over time at about 0.05 milligram per liter per year. So just a slight increase over time. Again, kind of argues with this idea that we're in a period of relative stability in our landscape. Over a 14-year monitoring period, that's 0.7 milligram per liter. As we're focused on the Raccoon River, especially the area above Sac City, what have concentrations done in this area that's part of the location that is being sued by the Des Moines Waterworks? We have actually a longer period of record available there from 1987 to 2014. You can divide this period of record in different ways and say, all right, over the last 25 years, what have concentrations doing in this river? Well, one of the things you notice is that when you come out of a drought, you see a lot of volatility in the nitrate concentration record. We saw the same volatility show up in the coming out of the 1980s drought as we did today, maybe slightly higher today. But in general, we saw a lot of volatility when you have a period of drought and you come out of it. If you look at the trends, this is why you need to be careful about trends. Concentrations will, over the entire period, 87 to 2014, show a slight increasing trend that wasn't significant. If you take the record and modify and shorten it a little bit to the period where we looked at those other rivers, it was actually decreasing. You had the 2013 and 2014 record, now the trend is still decreasing, but it's not significant. So our concentration is increasing, decreasing in the Raccoon River above Sac City. Tell me what time period you want to look at. Compared to the real history, now I would argue this is a very significant trend, okay, as opposed to working around the edges here of the last 10 or 20 years, okay? We've had a massive change in nitrate concentrations in our rivers. Phosphorus concentrations tell a different story. Concentrations are actually decreasing in phosphorus. Believe me, there's some interesting methodology that gets to this point because phosphorus is a lot different animal than nitrate concentrations, but we looked at 42 different sites. Most of them showed a decreasing trends. 12 were significantly decreasing. If you look at the histogram of all the trends, again, most of the trends in this case, those little tick marks down below, are on the negative side of zero. So it looks like phosphorus concentrations from 98 to 2013 are actually decreasing at a rate of about 2% per year. Good news is that it's also very consistent with what we've seen for the sediment. Okay, so decreasing phosphorus means again that we're decreasing sediment contributions to our streams. At this point, sediment loads relate to precip in general. So we have over the last 25 years, if it rains, we get high sediment. Compare the graph to the left there, which is the relationship of sediment load to precip over the 20th century, and there's a lot of scatter. That just says there was a lot of things going on earlier in the 20th century. All right, concluding remarks. So the 20th century pretty much indicates that you certainly can't be unaware or surprised that you make modifications to the landscape and you alter the hydrology and it's going to affect water quantity and quality. Okay, I don't believe anybody here would be surprised by that, and definitely not maybe after what I was talking about. Okay, that's just the norm, it's not the exception. The good news is that I would argue that the worst of the water quality is probably behind us, and I would call worst in terms of untreated city municipal discharge into our streams. Okay, that is a huge improvement that I think must be recognized. Also, I would say in this period of relative landscape stability, we see minor changes in water quality over time, but they're relatively stable to judge future benchmarks. So we try and make an effort to reduce these concentrations. The bad news is that given the investment in conservation and infrastructure over the course of the 20th century, and we saw the changes that occurred there, we're going to have to make a similar investment to realize our 21st century goals, especially if we want to achieve something like the 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus. It's taken a long time to get to this point. With a huge investment, it's going to take a long time and a huge investment to turn the tide. Okay, so given the challenges, I'll take a question or two as we, no, at the end. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith, for your compelling portrait of how water quality and quantity has changed in Iowa over the past 100-some years. Just as compelling is the story of how life on the farm has changed over the decades and how we viewed the role of farmers in our society. How was our portrait of the typical farm family developed, and where did that ideal come from? Does that portrait accurately reflect the widespread values of independence, hard work, and self-sufficiency we think of? When one chooses life on a farm in the very rural Midwest, does that require all of us to embrace certain values? We'll hear about post-war agricultural policy that was very much a debate over the future of rural America and how that debate was deeply laden with considerations about values. Todd Dresser is an associate lecturer of history and an instructional technologist at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. His current research looks at the development of rural sociology from the Progressive Era until the very early years in the Cold War. Specifically, he examines how family farm values, such as independence and self-reliance, have shifted back and forth through different eras of farming, family versus corporate farming. Please welcome Todd Dresser.
Okay, so I realize I'm the last thing standing between you guys and lunch. So I've made my talk a little bit, I can hive some things off as we go along. So I think I'll give you the bit of a shorter version of the talk so we can get to the question and answers and lunch as it is. And when I was asked to speak here, they asked me to talk as a historian. My training is in history. About the transition from family farms to industrial agriculture in Iowa. And there's sort of a couple ways to do that. One is to sort of give a bird's eye view approach of the topic, and the other is to sort of focus in on some representative stories. And I chose to do the second part of that, to focus in on some representative stories, what I think is an important moment in that transition from what you might think of as family-style agriculture to what we might think of as industrial-style agriculture, right around the end of the New Deal and World War II. So that's the frame for my talk. So here it goes. In July 1943, the U.S. Department of Agriculture convened a conference in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to discuss its strategy for post-war readjustment. As one of the main organizations in charge of advising on policy, the Bureau of Agricultural Economics ran the event. Also in attendance were the Secretary of Agriculture, Claude Wickard, leaders from many land-grant colleges, representatives of farmers' organizations such as the National Farmers Union and the American Farm Bureau Federation, and representatives from agribusiness, the Pioneer Seed Corporation and John Deere. Head of the Bureau of Agricultural Economics, Howard Tully, opened the meeting and handed the floor over to Secretary Wickard, whose remarks were rather perfunctory, until he stopped himself halfway through and began to address Howard Tully directly, and he said, quoting the Secretary of Agriculture, "Howard, perhaps I've come in a little late with this problem, but it's one that's always given me a concern. My question is this: in the post-war period, are you going to move towards highly mechanized farms, or are you going to think of farming as a way of life and not look at it purely from the standpoint of returns on investment?" I think most of us saw a trend in American agriculture during the recent years with the advent of the tractor and motorized equipment towards larger farms and larger units. I must admit I'm somewhat confused in my own thinking as to whether it is a desirable or undesirable trend. Do we want to say that this is the thing to do, that efficiency is of primary importance, or do we want to think about more of the human and social problems involved? These remarks from Claude Wickard are striking for a couple of reasons. First, they're candid. It'd be rare for, I think, a high-ranking U.S. official like the Secretary of Agriculture to sort of appear confused as he's trying to embark on a major policy-making endeavor. And second, was I think striking about it is that the USDA was seriously taking into consideration farming as a way of life, which seems to cut against, I think, the popular understandings of post-war agriculture and how that story sort of has permeated through popular culture. Rather, I think the story that we typically get, and Keith mentioned Earl Butz, is this idea of sort of get big or get out, or as popularized maybe by this image, sort of famous image from the 1970 National Geographic of the farm of the future, this sort of highly mechanized, robotically driven farm. This was the ideal towards which American agriculture was moving in 1970, right? Yet Wickard forces us to consider that to the extent that this was true, it was not necessarily full steam ahead. And despite Rachel Carson's declaration, for example, in Silent Spring, that post-war technology and science feared bigness above all else and become sort of her famous quote at the end of Silent Spring, a caveman's club beating against the environment, many who were allied with the USDA were also concerned with protecting rural traditions, farm values, and agricultural life. So today I want to talk about two people with significant ties to Iowa who share different takes on this idea of feeding the world and how one should best go about feeding the world in the post-war era, the post-1945 era. Both people embraced technology as well as family values, but did so in different ways. And the upshot of my talk is twofold. On the one hand, industrial farming and family farming are not necessarily oppositional categories. On the one hand, on the other, how we choose to blend these two things, business and a way of life, is very much a reflection of our values. The two men I want to talk about today, Luigi Ligutti and Theodore Schultz, exemplified this shift. Ligutti, seen here, was the head of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference during World War II and subsequently served as the Vatican observer to the Food and Agricultural Organization after World War II. He took many of the lessons he learned in Iowa and during the Depression and applied them to feeding war-torn refugees after World War II. He argued that family farm values ought to be modern and technologically efficient on the one hand, but not so that they undermine the nuclear family on the other. The other person I want to talk about today exemplifies the other side of Claude Wickard's remarks, and that's Theodore Schultz. As opposed to Ligutti, Schultz advocated for the heavy mechanization of agriculture. But as I hope to show you, this does not necessarily mean that he devalued humans. To the contrary, Schultz saw his work as part of a larger civil rights struggle which aimed at getting rural families, particularly African-American families, out of the impoverished sharecropping system in the South. In terms of feeding the world, he, like Ligutti, sought out a non-exploitative food system, but the scale, the technology for which he advocated could not have been more different. Okay, so our stand-in for this idea of farming as a way of life is Luigi Ligutti. As you can see, is there a laser here? Oh, anyways, he's the person wearing the pastoral outfit here. Next to him is Eleanor Roosevelt on a tour of his community in Iowa. Monsignor Ligutti was, as I said, the head of the National Rural Life Conference, a position he earned in part through his work during the New Deal with Subsistence Homesteads community in Granger, Iowa. Granger is northwest of Des Moines. It still exists today, or it's still a city today. Granger wrote that Subsistence Homesteads, and what the Subsistence Homesteads project was it was a project by which the federal government gave certain groups of people money to subsidize building. They gave them home loans, a home, access to infrastructure, and things like that. I'll talk more about the specifics of the project in a second. But it was to have a sort of modern, a couple acres of land on which you could farm and sort of build sort of your own safety net during the Depression. Liguori wrote about Granger, Iowa in ways that seem to prefigure modern environmentalism. He wrote that corporation farming will in time destroy itself with its mechanical methods in a field that is essentially biological. But before stupidity will reap its empty harvest, our American families will finally and completely be uprooted from the soil. All ownership will pass to United Farms Incorporated, sort of fictitious company that he makes up. All rural skills, cultural patterns, traditions, and communities will be obliterated. This picture here with Eleanor Roosevelt shows Liguori's importance, but also shows that while he was an idealist, he was also a pragmatist. He did not like the New Deal, and he saw its agricultural programs as helping to promote large-scale agriculture at the expense of Jeffersonian self-sufficiency. As you can see from this picture, perhaps Eleanor Roosevelt shared the same misgivings about him. I kind of like that picture, sort of showing her around one of his houses. And, he's a very persistent person. Anyway. So it was not without ambivalence that Liguori took money from the subsistence homestead programs, which provided a house loan, community infrastructure, access to extension, and a few acres of land to the subsistence homesteaders. But the need for help was real for Liguori and his parishioners. So applying for aid outweighed his other reservations. He saw the project as providing a means to our self-sufficiency and, importantly, acceptance for members of his flock. Liguori came to Western Iowa in 1923 to serve a congregation made up of immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe who had not necessarily assimilated very well into their the largely Protestant surroundings. The Slavic and Italian immigrants worked in the coal mines and served as cheap seasonal labor. The neighborhoods were what Liguori called a rural slum, and the United Mine Workers Union, headed by John L. Lewis, was uninterested in enrolling the immigrants at the risk of alienating the other workers in the region. Liguori recalls seeing no Italians need apply signs around town, and the boom and bust cycle of the mining life meant that the Italians would work for cheap wages during the good times, and then would often be blamed for taking other people's jobs during the bad times. And there was not much support to sort of support the Italian immigrants through those bad times. So here's just a few pictures of sort of prior to the subsistence homestead project. This is the area that Liguori calls a rural slum in the 1920s. This is actually Woodbine, Iowa, which Granger was a community completely constructed for the subsistence homestead project. So the first city he goes to is Woodbine. You can see the sort of workers' houses and dirt streets and things like that. Here's another sort of typical workman's house, right? So the subsistence homestead project was a way of breaking the dependency on industrial capitalism. The reason he thought that corporate farming would fail was because he had seen the repeated failures of the mining industry. Yet he was also concerned with rural traditions and customs. But he faced the problem that his parishioners, who came from Italy and Eastern Europe, didn't themselves know how to farm, and nor did he necessarily want to emulate Italian peasant culture in the United States. Right? So he wasn't necessarily concerned with the rural traditions of the people he actually served. And there's lots of reasons for that, one of which is that Benito Mussolini kind of had a monopoly on the public perception of the Italian peasant, right? He sort of modeled himself after workers of the soil and that sort of thing. And so this was not an image that Liguori wanted to adopt. He didn't want his flock to emulate the traditions that may have been most native to them necessarily. And this is sort of an interesting just side note, was that actually opposition to Mussolini was one way in which Liguori himself gains a bit of acceptance into Western Iowa. He comes in 1923, Mussolini came to power in 1922. Liguori couldn't go back to Italy, partly due to Mussolini's coming to power. Yet, Mussolini himself was not necessarily viewed, especially in the early years of the Depression, the Hoover years, as being a necessarily bad thing. One quick example of this is that the best-selling car in the late 1920s was the Ford Dictator, which was sold under the tagline, "A brilliant example of excess power." So this idea of sort of modern, efficient government tied to a strong executive was something that was not necessarily an unfavorable thing in many Americans' mind. However, in Herbert Hoover's home state of Iowa, opposition to characterizations of FDR as being a dictator would have been welcome. So it was a way for him to get a bit of recognition. So Lugudi uses a lot of modern technology to get his homesteads, subsistence homesteads, off the ground. Starting with the homes themselves, they were prefabricated floor plans, prefabricated homes built to sort of standard floor plans on which homesteaders could choose between a few different models depending on their finances and the size of their families. They had all the modern conveniences, plumbing, appliances, electricity, and they were laid out on these curvilinear streets which ended in cul-de-sacs, so that you had your front doors which opened on your neighbors, and that was sort of an attempt to sort of increase sociality. So you could go outside your front door and talk to your neighbors, but then your back doors opened on your acreage, and you could have that sort of area to yourself to tend, and that sort of thing. And Lugudi, sort of commenting on the homes themselves, says that the homestead to be is a modern, almost more than reasonably convenient farm, right? So that this isn't necessarily anti-technological, right? He's interested in all the sort of benefits of modern life and giving them to the people, washing machines and all the rest of it. But in doing so in a way that sort of is focused on the family unit, right? And the nuclear family unit in particular, right? This extended, then the project extends outside. Here are just a few pictures of the sort of building process, grading the land, a home at midpoint of construction, and then the finished home in Granger, Iowa. So these aren't, your typical post-war ranch-style houses, or sort of Levitt townhouse or something like that. These are, I think you see almost sort of halfway in between that, but nonetheless, there are these sort of prefabricated houses that were brought in and put up very quickly. Then outside, farmers are given access to modern breeds of animals, chickens, cows, ducks, etc., as well as grapes for making wine. Lugudi was very concerned that people would be able to make their own wine. Fruits, bee colonies, vegetables. Noticeably absent in Iowa was corn. Lugudi argued that people needed self-sufficiency first before they started selling crops like corn. And while he wanted farmers to have access to the benefits of modern life, he would, again, as I said, draw the line at those that would create dependencies, right? And so he didn't want people to grow up thinking that cereal wrapped in cellophane gotten from a supermarket, his quote was cereal wrapped in cellophane, was food, right? Rather, he wanted people to think that this was where food came from. Right, so here's, you can kind of see, a gender division of labor coming in here too. So here's, this was from a sort of an instructional series of photos from Granger, Iowa, of women learning how to take care of chickens. Here's someone learning how to milk a cow. And then also the men got their own. So I included this probably for Ken too, because he's interested in plowing practices and that kind of thing. So you can kind of see here's sort of straight line plowing still, even in an era which is developing the contour plowing. But. Okay. Lugudi also had the high school curriculum reflect his vision of technological integration. There are 2 tracks in the high school, one for boys and one for girls. The curriculum for boys almost reads like a list of merit badges. It included animal husbandry, crops and soils, vegetable production and management, landscaping, fruit growing, woodwork, plumbing, glasswork, electrical work, rope making, and leather work. The course for girls consisted of, quote, all things necessary to make a home run efficiently. These were clothing construction, care and repair of clothing, personal grooming, family relationships, home management, weaving, knitting, crocheting, embroidery, planning and preparing of food, buying and serving lunches, child care and development, and home care for the sick. In his weekly radio address, Lagoudy asserted that if one wanted a girl just like the one who married dear old dad, we have them here in Granger. And he worked hard in a sense to make that true, right? Even if the girls that married the dads that lived in that area were Italian immigrants and were nothing like the ones that he was educating in the schools in Granger, Iowa. Right, so Lagoudy is an interesting character. He was concerned with preserving rural traditions in the face of industrial technology, but he was not interested in the rural traditions of the people whom he was necessarily around. Rather, he purposely created rural traditions that spoke more to the wartime era in which he lived, rather than in a time from the past that he was interested in preserving. And the thing to keep in mind, of course, is that this was a post-war nuclear family that he was trying to create here. And the term family farm actually, interesting, sort of maps onto the rise in the use of the term family farm, right? And so that this combination of the nuclear family as a unit of production isn't necessarily, I don't know if you can necessarily read that very much. So across the bottom, actually, you have years starting in the 1880s, going to 1960, and as a growth of the use of the term family farm, and it really spikes right around this period, the sort of late 1930s, early 1940s, in which people start using that term family farm. And Lagoudy is very much part of that sort of nexus of, again, sort of combining ideals of the nuclear family that were just coming into popularity with the family farm. Sort of a single generational household. As I said, after the war, Lagoudy becomes a Vatican observer for the FAO, rebuilding efforts in Eastern Europe. And from this point, he helped direct how food aid ought to be apportioned and fit in with the culture and traditions of Catholics in Italy and Eastern Europe. And he based these ideas on what he learned in Granger. The upshot of the story of Lagoudy is that on the one hand, he seems to be a modern environmentalist, railing against big agriculture and noting the ironies of the dependence that it creates. He thought of himself later in his life, in his memoir, as the harbinger of E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful reforms. And we can also see echoes of Michael Pollan and Alice Waters in his work. On the other, he was very much a product of his time. The tradition and culture he was creating was an invention of his time, in particular the Cold War nuclear family. The traditions he created did not necessarily correspond particularly well with the immigrants, nor did they necessarily correspond with the Protestant Iowans, who did not have the sort of same gender division of labor that Lagoudy envisioned. Rather, prior to the war, many women worked alongside men in the fields, especially during busy months. Rather, the prefabricated homes filled with appliances, bought with government loans on a cul-de-sac, were very much a product of their times. Perhaps the lesson is that when we often invoke the idea of saving the family farm as a criticism of social forces we're against, but Lagoudy shows that the solutions in many ways are just as part of the contradictions of their era as the problems are. I'm going to skip over the next bit. As historians, we tend to like to sort of geek out about the documents that we find in the archives. So I brought in a bunch that I meant to sort of show as a way of sort of nesting Lagoudy in a larger story of World War II social scientists who were trying to understand what made some communities stable and other communities unstable. And what they found was that the communities that were stable were not necessarily anti-technology, but they integrated technology thoughtfully within trying to understand that the technology would not sort of undermine the culture of the region, and that those communities that were unstable tended to do the opposite. They tended to integrate technology in such a way as to undermine the stability of the community, or to be more individualistic rather than community-minded, I guess, in their adoption of technologies. And so that the most stable community was Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is an old order Amish community. And what's nice about these documents is that you can see what the person wanted you to get out of it. 1 minute remaining? Oh my gosh. All right. I'm going to flip through these. Anyways, these are all pictures of different technologies that, and then the least stable community is the Dust Bowl community of Haskell, Kansas, which has all these technology graveyards to industrial technology that were unstable for the community. These are all great documents. Anyways, the second Iowan I want to talk about today is Theodore Schultz. This is a much quicker story than the Lagouti story, because Schultz was less of an Iowan than Lagouti was. He grew up in South Dakota, took his PhD at Wisconsin in agricultural economics, and worked at Iowa State, and from there developed a rationale for highly mechanized farms coupled with social supports to displace agricultural laborers, what he called homesteads in reverse. So he could not have been more different than Lagouti. In an era obsessed with full employment, the post-war era, Schultz looked at the countryside and saw a lot of wasted human potential. Moreover, the human waste was exacerbated by the Jim Crow segregation in the U.S. South, which had permanently created an underclass of workers. In developing his critique of the New Deal, Schultz echoed the work of another economist, Gunnar Myrdal, who wrote a famous, influential book called An American Dilemma. Is anyone familiar with this work by any chance? Okay, a couple people. I'd say go check it out from the library. It's interesting. You'll never read the whole thing. It's 1,500 pages of economic data. But weirdly enough, it was something of a bestseller because it was a way of Americans to sort of analyze themselves. And the Carnegie Foundation funded the research, and Myrdal was a Swedish economist whom the Carnegie Foundation hired to sort of understand the economic underpinnings of race relations. And he spends most of his time in the U.S. South looking at sharecroppers because that's where many African Americans lived. Anyways, Gunnar Myrdal's work, and probably the thing that most people remember about it, was that it has some of the first depictions of lynchings that reached a wide audience. When economists, however, in American Dilemma challenged many of the assumptions behind the New Deal programs. Rather than working to alleviate poverty and promote racial equity, Myrdal showed that many of the programs had the opposite effect. Right? Programs such as subsistence homesteads make farmers go in for a system of self-sufficiency that only succeeded in getting farmers to, quote, use inefficient techniques to the extent that they would be working hard and getting little in return. So where Lagouti saw preserving rural traditions, he's seeing inefficiency. Right? Moreover, these subsistence programs, quote, required a permanent stifling of ambition, and an economic dictatorship arose to separate those retained in commercial agriculture from those forced into self-sufficient agriculture. This, of course, is a problem that falls more heavily on the Negro population, end quote. Myrdal argued that New Deal programs forced rural poor, especially African Americans, into a subsistence lifestyle and offered little hope for advancement. A condition he likened to a dictatorship arose between the owners of capital and those who were forced to eke out a living on cotton plantations. Right? So this is one of the sort of famous quotes of that book, is in the introduction, is that any doctrine that eliminates or even obscures the function of choice, the choice of where to live, helps create the attitudes that welcome and support the totalitarian state. And so he's likening sharecropping in the U.S. South to life under totalitarianism, saying that mechanization, in a sense, the upshot is that mechanization would increase the amount of choice that agricultural laborers had to leave and to go seek employment elsewhere, right? So these are some of the images from that work. Here's sharecropping family depictions of lynching that result from this sort of quasi-totalitarian state that he's talking about. Okay. So Schultz and Myrdal argue for heavily mechanized policies that will drive, hopefully, free up the labor to move from the south to the north as part of the Great Migration after World War II, and replace what Schultz calls the dead hand of the past with the invisible hand of the market. So he sort of sees mechanization as a way of again, freeing these agricultural laborers up, to not have to work in agriculture anymore and rather work in factories getting white and blue collar jobs in the industrial north. Right. So we have two different ideas in a sense about how to feed the world, which originate in Iowa and appear to be very different. Lagudi on the one hand, who was against large corporate farming, thought keeping people in rural areas was a good idea. He even started a campaign called One Foot in the Country, in which industrial workers could start their own urban homesteads. And he thought that the small family farms was a way to bring about sort of more beneficial ethnic relations. Schultz, by contrast, was in favor of large farms as a means to enable all workers, agricultural and others, to achieve their full personal capacity in a post-war full employment environment. He thought that feeding the world was not a respectable or respected profession, and worse yet, he thought that keeping people down on the farm was to stifle their ambition unnecessarily. Worse yet, he thought agricultural policy as it was favored sharecropping system and kept Jim Crow alive. So one can see why Claude Wickard at the beginning was confused. Both of these guys, as well as many more, had voices in his ear, their voices in his ear. Both of them made persuasive points, both had logic and history on their side, but the upshot for those of us is that farming as a business and farming as a way of life are inseparable, and perhaps Wickard knew that all along. So that's all I have.